A racist white woman's unfounded suspicions lead to a dramatic confrontation on Flight 287 when she targets Jonathan Clark, a reserved black man traveling for work. Margaret Wright's unease begins the moment she spots Jonathan boarding the plane. Her watchful eyes track his every move as he calmly navigates the aisle and settles into his seat near the emergency exit. Though Jonathan projects nothing but quiet confidence, Margaret feels a spark of discomfort she can't ignore. Seated just a few rows behind, Margaret picks up the in-flight magazine, her fingers nervously tapping on the armrest as her gaze flickers back to Jonathan. She leans forward to catch the attention of Linda, a passing flight attendant, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Excuse me," she begins, glancing toward Jonathan as if confiding a secret. "That man near the emergency exit, is it really safe for him to be sitting there?" Linda's polite smile never wavers. "I assure you, ma'am, all passengers have been thoroughly screened, and our seating arrangements are in compliance with safety regulations." Margaret purses her lips, her unease bubbling just below the surface. "I just thought, with everything going on in the world, it's better to be cautious, isn't it?" "Of course, ma'am. If there's anything else you need, just let me know," Linda said, her tone professional as she moved on to assist other passengers. Jonathan, unaware of Margaret's scrutiny, leaned back in his seat, trying to relax. The book in his hands was a well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a story he returned to often for both comfort and inspiration. He felt the tension of the past week beginning to dissipate as the plane filled with passengers. Across the aisle, Margaret's unease grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan didn't belong in the emergency exit row. She didn't understand why it bothered her so much, but the idea that someone like him might have control in an emergency unsettled her. She drummed her fingers on the armrest, her mind racing with scenarios that fed her anxiety. The flight crew completed their final checks, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard Flight 287 to Los Angeles. Jonathan placed his book on the tray table as the engines roared to life. The plane began to taxi, and he gazed out the window, watching the runway blur into motion. Margaret tightened her seatbelt, stealing glances at Jonathan as the plane lifted off. Her discomfort hadn't lessened. If anything, it had intensified. She leaned slightly toward the middle-aged man seated beside her. "Did you notice that man near the emergency exit?" she whispered. The man blinked, caught off guard. "Not really. Why?" Margaret shook her head. "Something about him seems off. Don't you think we should be cautious?" The man shrugged. "He looks fine to me. You're probably overthinking it." Margaret bristled. "Overthinking? These days you can't be too careful." The man gave her a tight smile and returned to his crossword puzzle, leaving Margaret feeling dismissed. The flight leveled out at cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Flight attendants moved down the aisles with drink carts, and passengers adjusted their headphones or turned the pages of novels. Jonathan sipped from a water bottle, his mind drifting to the case awaiting him in Los Angeles. He knew it would be a challenge, but challenges were his specialty. Margaret, however, remained on edge. She watched as Jonathan reached into his carry-on bag, retrieving a small case of medication. Her breath caught, her imagination running wild. She leaned into the aisle again, signaling Linda. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Linda asked, her tone calm but firm. Margaret lowered her voice. "I've been watching him. He keeps checking that bag. I really think someone should look into it." Linda glanced toward Jonathan, who was now taking his medication, then back at Margaret. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I assure you everything is under control. Please try to enjoy the flight." Margaret crossed her arms, her frustration mounting. This is why things go wrong. People ignore the signs until it's too late. Linda gave her a polite nod and continued down the aisle. Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks, her unease morphing into indignation. She didn't understand why no one else saw what she did. Meanwhile, Linda discreetly updated her colleague Jim at the back of the plane. "Keep an eye on seat 12A, she whispered. "The passenger in 16C is concerned about him. Says he's acting suspicious." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious how?" Linda sighed. "Checking his bag, apparently. Nothing concrete. I think it's just nerves, but let's stay alert. Jim nodded. Got it. Margaret wasn't giving up. She turned to the elderly woman seated beside her, lowering her voice but speaking with urgency. Have you noticed that man near the emergency exit? Margaret asked. Doesn't he seem out of place? The woman glanced briefly at Jonathan. I hadn't noticed anything. Margaret leaned closer. He's been checking his bag repeatedly. I told the flight attendant, but they're not doing anything. I think we should be concerned. The elderly woman smiled politely, her tone gentle but firm. I'm sure if there were a problem, the crew would address it. Best to let them handle things. Margaret pressed her lips into a tight line, her irritation growing. How could no one else see what she saw? Jonathan noticed the glances, the occasional hushed whispers directed his way. Years of experience had taught him how to read a room, and it was clear that something, or someone, was stirring unease. He didn't let it show. Instead, he adjusted his posture, maintaining his calm demeanor. Margaret, however, saw his poise as proof of his duplicity. He was too calm, too collected. She convinced herself that she was the only one seeing the truth. Margaret finally caught the attention of a middle-aged man seated in front of her. Excuse me, she said, tapping his shoulder. Have you noticed anything unusual about that man near the emergency exit? The man turned, startled. Not really. What about him? Margaret leaned in conspiratorially. He keeps checking his bag, like he's worried someone will notice what's inside. I've told the flight attendants, but they're brushing me off. The man frowned. If the flight crew isn't concerned, maybe it's nothing. Margaret's voice grew firmer. And what if it's not nothing? Are you willing to take that chance? The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I guess you might have a point, but I don't think we should jump to conclusions. Margaret nodded, satisfied that she'd planted a seed of doubt. Exactly. We need to stay vigilant. The cabin buzzed with the low hum of conversation and activity, but a subtle tension was beginning to ripple outward. Margaret's unease, coupled with her whispered comments to passengers, was spreading like smoke in a confined space. Though most dismissed her concerns, a few began to watch Jonathan with wary eyes, their perceptions colored by Margaret's whispers. Jonathan remained focused on his book, but he couldn't ignore the shifting energy around him. He felt the weight of the stares, the judgment in them. It wasn't new to him. He had faced prejudice before, but it never ceased to sting. He adjusted his seatbelt, choosing to rise above the growing tension. As the flight hummed on, Margaret's conviction grew stronger. In her mind, she wasn't sowing discord. She was protecting everyone on board. And as her suspicions mounted, so did the potential for conflict. The air, confined and inescapable, felt thick with anticipation. The hum of the airplane engines was steady, a calming rhythm for most passengers on board Flight 287. For Jonathan Clark, it was a backdrop to the peaceful escape of his book. For Margaret Wright, however, it was the soundtrack to her escalating anxiety. She sat rigid in her seat, her eyes glued to Jonathan, who was completely unaware of her growing unease. To her, every page he turned, every glance he cast at his bag, was proof of some hidden danger. Margaret clenched her jaw as Jonathan reached down to adjust his carry-on bag beneath his seat. That was it. She couldn't wait any longer. She felt a moral obligation to act, convinced that inaction would put everyone on the flight in danger. Taking a deep breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood abruptly. The movement caught the attention of nearby passengers, who glanced up, curious about the sudden commotion. Margaret moved down the aisle with quick, determined steps, her eyes locked on Jonathan. When she reached his row, she stood over him, her presence sharp and invasive. You, Margaret said, her voice loud enough to cut through the soft hum of the cabin. I want to know what's in that bag. Jonathan looked up from his book, his expression calm but puzzled. He glanced around, noticing passengers starting to watch the interaction. Excuse me, he said evenly. You heard me, Margaret snapped, her voice shaking slightly, though whether it was from fear or conviction, even she wasn't sure. You've been fidgeting with that bag since we took off. What are you hiding in there? Jonathan set his book down on the tray table, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Ma'am, I'm not hiding anything. It's just my personal belongings." Margaret crossed her arms, her posture defiant. "That's not good enough. You've been acting suspicious this entire flight, and I have a right to know what you're carrying." Passengers murmured among themselves, some leaning into the aisle for a better view. Linda, the flight attendant, quickly made her way down the aisle, her expression a mixture of professionalism and concern. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" Linda asked, stepping between Margaret and Jonathan. "Yes, there's a problem," Margaret said, her voice rising. She gestured toward Jonathan. "This man is hiding something in his bag. I've been watching him, and he keeps checking it like he's worried someone will find out. I'm telling you, he's up to something." Jonathan sighed quietly, leaning back in his seat. His calm demeanor was unshaken, but there was a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "I've already explained. There's nothing dangerous in my bag. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight." Linda turned to Jonathan, her tone soothing. "Sir, I understand this is uncomfortable. Would you mind showing me what's in your bag? It might help put this to rest." Jonathan hesitated, glancing around the cabin at the watching eyes. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he resented the insinuation that he needed to prove himself innocent. After a brief pause, he nodded. "Fine," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. He reached down and unzipped his bag. Slowly and deliberately, he pulled out a clear plastic case containing his medication. He held it up for Linda and Margaret to see. "This," he said, his tone even, "is heart medication. I have a condition that requires me to take it regularly. That's why I've been checking my bag, to make sure it's secure." Linda nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your cooperation." Margaret, however, wasn't satisfied. She narrowed her eyes, shaking her head. "That can't be it. You're hiding something else. You're too calm. It's not normal." Jonathan closed his bag with deliberate care and placed it back under the seat. He looked Margaret directly in the eyes. "Ma'am, I don't know what else to tell you. There's nothing more in that bag. I suggest you take your seat and let everyone enjoy the rest of the flight." Margaret bristled, her voice rising. "You don't get to dismiss me. I'm not stupid. I know when something's wrong. Why else would you be acting so suspicious?" By now, the entire cabin was watching the confrontation. Some passengers looked concerned, while others exchanged knowing glances, irritated by the disruption. A man a few rows back muttered, "What's her problem?" loud enough for others to hear. Linda placed a hand on Margaret's arm, her voice low and calm. "Ma'am, please lower your voice and return to your seat. There's no evidence of any threat here." Margaret turned on Linda, her frustration boiling over. "No evidence? You're just taking his word for it? What if he's lying? What if he's planning something, and we're all too afraid to stop him?" Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. When he opened them, his voice was measured but resolute. "Ma'am, I am not lying. I'm just a man trying to get to Los Angeles for work. If you want to keep accusing me of something without evidence, that's your choice. But I won't stand for being harassed." Linda stepped closer to Margaret, her professionalism holding firm. "Ma'am, this behavior is unacceptable. If you continue to disturb the other passengers, I will have to notify the captain and involve security upon landing." Margaret's face turned red, her fists clenching. "Fine," she snapped, her voice dripping with indignation. "But don't say I didn't warn you when something goes wrong." She spun around and marched back to her seat, muttering under her breath. Linda turned to Jonathan, her expression apologetic. "I'm so sorry for the disturbance, sir. Please let me know if there's anything I can do." Jonathan shook his head. "Thank you, but I'm fine. I just want to get through this flight." Linda gave him a sympathetic smile before addressing the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Please remain seated and enjoy the rest of the flight." As Linda walked away, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, picking up his book again. His calm exterior belied the frustration simmering inside him. He wasn't a stranger to such confrontations, but they never got easier. Around the cabin, the murmurs of conversation resumed. Some passengers exchanged looks of disbelief at Margaret's behavior, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Margaret sat stiffly in her seat, her arms crossed, convinced she had done the right thing despite the flight crew's dismissal. The tension in the air lingered, a reminder of how quickly fear and suspicion could disrupt the fragile balance of shared space. But Jonathan remained composed, determined not to let the incident define him or the flight. He turned another page of his book, the words a welcome distraction as the plane soared on. The tension in the cabin was thick, the murmurs of passengers like a low hum beneath the drone of the engines. Jonathan Clark sat quietly, his book unopened on his lap. His outward calmness masked the internal frustration roiling beneath the surface. He had been here before, in the crosshairs of baseless suspicion, and he knew that staying composed was the only way to rise above it. Across the aisle, Margaret Wright sat stiffly, her arms crossed, and her gaze fixed on Jonathan. Her unease had grown into full-blown indignation, a bubbling mix of fear and defiance. The whispers of nearby passengers only fueled her conviction, even as they exchanged disapproving glances at her behavior. Jonathan took a deep breath and looked up. The quiet chatter in the cabin ceased almost instantly as passengers turned their attention to him. Slowly, deliberately, he stood, placing his book carefully on the seat. His calm demeanor, the controlled precision of his movements, drew the eyes of everyone nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the silence. "I'd like to address the concerns that have been raised about me during this flight." He reached into his pocket, his movements deliberate and visible, and withdrew a sleek black wallet. Flipping it open, he revealed a shining badge and ID card. "My name is Jonathan Clark," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin with quiet authority. "I am a civil rights attorney. I'm traveling to Los Angeles to represent a client in a critical case. The medication in my bag is for a heart condition, and I've done nothing on this flight that warrants suspicion or accusations." A ripple of surprise moved through the passengers. Many leaned closer, their curiosity piqued, while others exchanged relieved glances. The badge, its authenticity unquestionable, seemed to deflate much of the tension in the air. Jonathan's steady voice and professional demeanor exuded credibility. "Throughout my career," Jonathan continued, "I've represented people who face discrimination and injustice. I've encountered situations like this before, but I always hope for better, for understanding, for respect. I assure you there is nothing to fear from me. I am simply here to get to my destination, just like the rest of you." The cabin was silent for a moment, passengers processing his words. A few nodded in understanding, others cast furtive glances toward Margaret, their expressions tinged with disapproval. Linda, the flight attendant, approached Jonathan, her face a mixture of apology and admiration. "Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Clark," she said softly. "I'm sorry you've had to go through this. If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let us know." Jonathan gave her a small nod. "Thank you. I just want to move past this." But Margaret was not ready to let it go. She rose from her seat abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "This is a show," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You think a badge proves anything? People can fake those. You're not fooling me." Jonathan turned to her, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, you're entitled to your opinion, but I have nothing to prove to you. The flight crew has already addressed this situation." Margaret's voice rose, her composure unraveling. "No, you don't get to dismiss me. You've been suspicious since you boarded. I don't care what anyone says. I know what I saw, and I won't sit here quietly while you... Her words faltered as she gestured wildly toward Jonathan. Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their sympathy for Margaret dissipating with each outburst. Some muttered in frustration, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Linda stepped in, her voice firm. "Ma'am, that's enough. Mr. Clark has shown his credentials and explained himself. Your behavior is disrupting the flight, and it needs to stop now." Margaret whirled on Linda, her eyes wide and filled with defiance. "You're defending him? Protecting him? Don't you see what he's doing? You're all blind." Linda took a step closer, her tone unwavering. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to return to your seat and remain calm. If you refuse to comply, I will have no choice but to involve the captain." Margaret's breathing quickened, her indignation spilling into hysteria. She pointed at Jonathan again, her voice growing shrill. "You're all going to regret this. I'm telling you, he's dangerous, and when something happens, it'll be on your hands." Passengers recoiled from her outburst. A man across the aisle muttered, "This is ridiculous." A woman in the next row added, "Why won't she just stop?" The tide of opinion was clearly turning against Margaret, but she seemed oblivious. Linda exchanged a glance with Jim, another flight attendant, who was already moving toward the cockpit. Moments later, Captain Harris's calm, authoritative voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're aware of a situation in the cabin and are taking steps to address it. We ask that all passengers remain seated and calm for the duration of the flight. Thank you for your cooperation." Margaret froze for a moment, her face pale, as the captain's words sank in. She looked around at the other passengers, seeing the disapproval in their faces, the judgment in their eyes. Still, she didn't back down. "You're all making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "You'll see." Jim returned from the cockpit with two members of the flight crew. They flanked Margaret, their expressions firm but professional. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us to the rear of the plane." Margaret's eyes darted between them, her voice breaking. "You're kicking me out? I'm trying to protect you." The crew member's tone remained calm. "Ma'am, you're disrupting the flight and making other passengers uncomfortable. We need you to cooperate." Reluctantly, Margaret allowed herself to be guided toward the back of the plane. Her steps were slow, and her head swiveled toward Jonathan one last time, her eyes burning with disbelief. "This isn't over," she hissed. As she disappeared from view, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had gripped the passengers loosened, replaced by relief. Linda returned to Jonathan's side, her voice soft. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Clark. We're doing everything we can to make sure the rest of the flight is smooth." Jonathan offered a small smile, though his eyes betrayed the weariness of the ordeal. "I appreciate your professionalism, Linda. I just hope this is the end of it." Passengers began murmuring again, their conversations no longer filled with fear, but with disbelief at Margaret's behavior. Some glanced at Jonathan with expressions of sympathy or apology, though few spoke directly to him. Jonathan returned to his seat, his badge still in hand. He tucked it back into his pocket, leaned back, and closed his eyes. For the first time in hours, the cabin felt quieter, calmer. Yet the weight of the confrontation lingered, a reminder of the biases that still pervaded even the most mundane spaces. The plane soared on toward Los Angeles, carrying its passengers toward their destination and leaving the chaos of the confrontation behind. The plane's engines hummed steadily as it began its descent toward Los Angeles. Outside the windows, the city sprawled below, its endless grid of lights glowing like a field of stars against the approaching twilight. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was tense but quieter now, the earlier commotion still lingering in the minds of the passengers. Jonathan Clark sat in his seat, calm and composed as always. His book lay closed on his lap, a symbol of the peace he had sought but never fully attained on this flight. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, some curious, others apologetic, but he remained focused on the task ahead, reaching his destination and continuing his work. Margaret Wright, on the other hand, sat rigidly in the back of the plane, flanked by two members of the flight crew. Her face was flushed with indignation, her hands gripping the armrests of her seat. She muttered under her breath, her words a mix of disbelief and frustration, as though still trying to convince herself, and anyone who might listen, that she had been right all along. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed. We thank you for your cooperation and apologize for any inconvenience caused during the flight." The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding, and passengers began adjusting their belongings in preparation for landing. The usual pre-landing routine offered a semblance of normalcy, though the earlier drama still hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Jonathan leaned back, letting out a quiet sigh. He wasn't angry. Years of navigating similar situations had taught him how to maintain his composure. But there was a familiar ache of frustration. He had hoped this flight would be uneventful, a brief respite before the intense work awaiting him in Los Angeles. Instead, it had become another lesson in resilience, another reminder of the biases he constantly faced. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the landing gear gripping the tarmac as the engines roared to slow the aircraft. A collective exhale swept through the cabin as passengers felt the reassuring weight of solid ground beneath them. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisle, ensuring that everyone remained seated as the plane taxied to the gate. Margaret, however, was anything but calm. Her muttering had grown louder, her tone defensive. "You'll all see," she said, her voice carrying to nearby passengers. "You're making a mistake. I was just trying to keep everyone safe." Linda, the lead flight attendant, approached her carefully, her professionalism unwavering. "Ma'am, please remain calm. Security will meet us at the gate to address any concerns you have. Until then, I need you to stay seated." Margaret's eyes flashed with defiance. "Concerns? I was the only one who saw the truth, and this is how I'm treated?" Linda didn't respond, her years of experience guiding her through the moment. Instead, she returned to the front of the plane, where she stopped by Jonathan's seat. "Mr. Clark," she said softly, "we've arranged for airport security to escort the passenger off the plane first. We'll also make sure you disembark safely. I just wanted to thank you again for your patience and composure." Jonathan looked up at her, his expression warm but measured. "You've handled a difficult situation with grace, Linda. I appreciate your professionalism." The plane came to a halt at the gate, and the familiar chime indicated it was safe for passengers to begin gathering their belongings. However, the usual hustle and bustle were replaced by an uneasy stillness as everyone waited to see how the situation with Margaret would unfold. Two security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence immediately commanding attention. They moved with quiet authority toward the back of the cabin, where Margaret sat. She straightened in her seat, her face a mix of indignation and disbelief. "This is absurd," she said loudly as the officers approached. "I've done nothing wrong. I was just trying to protect everyone." One of the officers spoke calmly. "Ma'am, we'd like to have a conversation with you off the plane. Please gather your belongings and come with us." Margaret looked around, searching for support among the passengers. Instead, she found only weary glances and a few whispered words of disapproval. Reluctantly, she rose from her seat, her movements stiff with resistance. As she was escorted down the aisle, her voice rose again. "You're all making a mistake. I was trying to do the right thing, and this is the thanks I get." The cabin was silent, save for her protests, until she disappeared through the exit. Once she was gone, a palpable sense of relief washed over the passengers. Jonathan stood slowly, retrieving his carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. He paused, looking around at the faces of his fellow passengers. Some looked away, others offered him small, apologetic smiles. He decided to address the group, and his tone was measured and kind. "I understand that today's events have been unsettling," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around him. "But I want to assure everyone that there was never a threat on this flight. I'm just here to do my job and get to my destination like all of you." A few passengers nodded in acknowledgement. One man spoke up, his voice tinged with regret. "I'm sorry we didn't step in sooner. It wasn't fair what you went through." Jonathan offered a small, reassuring smile. "I appreciate that. It's not always easy to speak up in moments like this. What matters is that we all got here safely." As the passengers began to disembark, some stopped to offer Jonathan quiet words of support. A woman in her 30s placed a hand on his arm briefly, saying, "Thank you for handling everything so calmly. You shouldn't have had to." Another man, holding a young child's hand, added, "It was wrong, what she did. "I'm sorry." Jonathan accepted each gesture with grace, his own words carefully chosen to put others at ease. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the weight of the day begin to lift. He knew this incident would stay with him, as so many similar moments had. But it wouldn't define him. He had a job to do, a purpose to fulfill, and he would continue to move forward. Behind him, the passengers of Flight 287 scattered into the airport, their thoughts lingering on what they had witnessed. Many would reflect on their silence during the confrontation, questioning what they might do differently if faced with a similar situation in the future. For Jonathan, the experience was another reminder of the work still to be done, but also of the strength he carried within him, a strength that could not be shaken by fear or prejudice. The baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with the usual cacophony of announcements, conversations, and the steady whir of the luggage carousel. Amid the chaos, Jonathan Clark stood composed, his carry-on bag slung over one shoulder, as he waited for his checked suitcase to appear. The events of the flight lingered in his mind, not as an open wound, but as a familiar ache. He had endured moments like this before, but they never lost their sting. Passengers from Flight 287 trickled into the area, many casting glances in Jonathan's direction. Some hesitated, as though debating whether to approach him, while others shuffled past, avoiding eye contact altogether. Jonathan noticed but did not let it faze him. He was accustomed to navigating these moments with quiet dignity. A middle-aged man in a navy blazer was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his expression sheepish. "Mr. Clark," he began, his voice low. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not stepping in sooner. What happened on that flight wasn't right." Jonathan offered a small, gracious smile. "Thank you. It's never easy to step into a tense situation, but I appreciate your words." Encouraged by the exchange, others began to approach. A young woman with a toddler on her hip said, "I was sitting a few rows behind you. I should have spoken up when I saw what was happening. You handled it with so much grace." Jonathan nodded, his voice calm and kind. "It's a complicated situation for everyone, but I hope it serves as a reminder that we all have the power to stand up for what's right." As more passengers expressed their regret and support, Jonathan took the time to acknowledge each one, his words measured and thoughtful. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he felt the weight of their apologies. While they were well-intentioned, they served as a stark reminder of how often people chose silence in the face of injustice, leaving those like him to shoulder the burden alone. Margaret Wright, meanwhile, sat stiffly in a chair within a secure area of the airport, her arms crossed and her face flushed. Across the table from her sat two security officers, their expressions professional but firm. Margaret's protests, which had echoed through the terminal moments earlier, had subsided into a simmering frustration. "Mrs. Wright," one of the officers began, his tone measured, "we've reviewed the incident on board the flight. Based on statements from the crew and passengers, it's clear that your behavior caused significant disruption. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Margaret bristled, her voice defensive. "I was just trying to protect everyone. That man, he looked suspicious. You can't tell me I was wrong to be cautious." The officer's gaze remained steady. "Ma'am, Mr. Clark is a well-respected attorney with no criminal record. He was calm and cooperative throughout the flight, while your behavior escalated to the point of creating panic among passengers. This kind of disruption is taken seriously." Margaret's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," she said quietly. I thought I was doing the right thing." The second officer leaned forward, her tone firm, but not unkind. "Sometimes our assumptions can lead us to act in ways that aren't fair or justified. It's important to reflect on why we felt the way we did, and how our actions impact others." Margaret didn't respond, her thoughts swirling as the officers continued to outline the consequences she might face, including a potential fine and being placed on an airline watch list. The weight of her choices began to sink in, though her pride made it difficult to admit even to herself that she might have been wrong. Jonathan finally spotted his suitcase sliding onto the carousel. He stepped forward to retrieve it, then paused for a moment, taking in the scene around him. The crowd had thinned, but the echoes of the earlier tension still lingered in the air. He took a deep breath, letting the rhythmic hum of the carousel ground him. This wasn't the first time Jonathan had been the target of suspicion and prejudice. As a black man and a civil rights attorney, he had spent years navigating the subtle and sometimes overt biases woven into everyday life. He had long since learned to pick his battles, to decide when to educate and when to simply walk away. But something about this experience felt different. Perhaps it was the starkness of Margaret's accusations, the blatant distrust in her eyes. Perhaps it was the way other passengers had looked on, hesitant and uncertain, until the truth had been laid bare. Whatever the reason, Jonathan knew he couldn't let the moment pass without taking action. He thought of the countless individuals he had represented in court, people whose lives had been upended by discrimination and systemic bias. He thought of the young interns at his firm, eager and idealistic, who looked to him for guidance. And he thought of the passengers on Flight 287, some of whom had chosen to speak up after the fact, their regret palpable. Jonathan made a decision. He would use this experience as fuel for his work. It wasn't just about winning cases or changing policies. It was about fostering understanding, encouraging people to confront their biases, and creating spaces where moments like this would become relics of the past. As Jonathan walked toward the terminal's exit, his resolve solidified. He would write about the experience, share it with his network, and use it as a teaching moment. He would speak at conferences and workshops, reminding people of the importance of empathy and the dangers of unchecked prejudice. And he would continue to fight in courtrooms and boardrooms, advocating for a society where dignity and respect were extended to all. A voice called out behind him, breaking his train of thought. "Mr. Clark?" He turned to see Linda, the flight attendant, hurrying toward him. Her expression was earnest, a mix of apology and admiration. "I just wanted to say thank you again," she said, "for how you handled everything. It couldn't have been easy." Jonathan offered her a warm smile. "You handled it well, too. These situations aren't easy for anyone." Linda hesitated, then added, "I hope this doesn't discourage you. I can tell you're someone who makes a difference." "It won't," Jonathan assured her. "If anything, it's a reminder of why I do what I do." They exchanged a brief handshake before parting ways, Linda heading back toward the gate and Jonathan stepping out into the cool evening air. As Jonathan walked out of the terminal, the weight of the flight's events lingered in his mind, but so did the words of passengers who had approached him with heartfelt apologies and reflections. He knew this wasn't just another flight. It was a microcosm of the biases and challenges many people face daily. Yet Jonathan chose not to let the bitterness of the experience define him. Instead, he saw an opportunity. In the face of prejudice, Jonathan had chosen grace. He had shown that dignity and composure could diffuse even the most charged situations. But more than that, he realized this moment could spark a deeper conversation. With his platform as a prominent civil rights attorney, Jonathan vowed to turn this incident into fuel for his mission to foster understanding and challenge discrimination wherever it lurked. As he picked up his luggage and headed into the bustling city, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. One encounter at a time, he thought, we can break the chains of ignorance and build bridges of empathy. This story reminds us all, the power to inspire change often lies in how we respond to adversity. Let's be the voices that challenge injustice and the hands that build a kinder, more inclusive world. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire change, foster understanding, and celebrate the power of resilience. Together, we can make a difference.